Okay, so the question is, what's my opinion on the emphasis placed on engaging and activating the core as opposed to the other big muscles? And why is it so important and constantly cued, especially in yoga or a lifting context? Great question. I really like talking about this. So let's dig into it. The first thing to get clear on is, what are we talking about when we're talking about the core? We're talking about all the muscles of the trunk, generally below the chest and above the waist. So we've got, if we look at the diagram here, we've got the obliques, internal and external. We've got rectus abdominis, the TVA, and all the muscles of the lower back, and even the lats I would class as a core muscle because they have such a big influence on the way the trunk is organized, and also they attach down at the pelvis and in the lumbar spine. So now we know what the core is. What is the core for? What's the function of the core? And I think, like most parts of our physiology, the primary function is protection, and the core is especially important in that it protects the spine and the spinal cord, which is essential for controlling the middle and lower parts of the body. So we want to avoid damage to that at all costs. And this is why back spasms are a thing. The body basically detects that there is excessive and uncontrolled motion of the spine, which is a key phrase that we'll come back to. And it locks down the muscles surrounding generally the lower back so that there is no more motion than is absolutely necessary. It can be painful, but it means that the spinal cord is not going to get damaged through excessive motion through the spine. So it's a protective mechanism, which is really important. So that's number one. We want to protect the spine. Number two is that it links the lower and upper body. So when we're doing full body, powerful, explosive movements in sport, the transfer of the force that's generated by the biggest, strongest muscles of the lower body into the upper extremities, so into the arms and hands, has to pass through the core. So we're looking for good and efficient transfer of that force. If we have a core that is unable to control that force transfer, we're basically missing out on a lot of that lower body power that we can generate more easily with the bigger, stronger muscles of the body. And the third thing I'd say is a key function of the core is just providing a foundation for the upper body to express strength. So if you're doing something like a military press or standing presses, if you're doing jerks or any overhead movements and you've got a weak or poorly functioning core, then it's like trying to press on a Bosu ball as an extreme example. That instability down below makes things a lot harder. So you're going to shut down your capacity to generate force and also your mobility. As your body feels unstable, it will reduce ranges of motion because it doesn't feel safe. So if those are the functions of the core, why are we so focused on bracing the midline and holding it still? As always, it depends on the goal. What are we trying to achieve with our body in our training? And the question I want to ask is, should the core be still or should it be moving? What do we really want out of it? And I think there is an overemphasis placed on stillness in most core training, because in day-to-day life, in sport especially, the core needs to move. So even in functional fitness and gym-based sports like CrossFit, there is a lot of core stillness, but there is also a lot of core motion that we need. For example, in kipping gymnastics, we need a huge amount of flexion and extension through the spine. We want to be strong and we want to be controlled through those motions. So if we're always training stillness and isometrics, we're not conditioning our body to increase its capacity through those motions. Another point to make on the sporting front is, if we look at classic ball sports like golf or tennis or even football, the spine is constantly in motion as well. There's always, even let's look at tennis as a simple example. In a game of tennis, if you're serving, you're going to go from extension into flexion. If you're reaching one side or the other, you're going to be side bending both ways. And obviously there's a huge amount of rotation going through the spine as well to hit any of your ground strokes. So again, we see another example that training the core for stillness is not going to have a great transfer and carryover into the sport specific demands on the body. So if that's the case, then why would we brace in the first place? And one of the principles here is that proximal stability can contribute to distal mobility. So being more still in your center lays that foundation to permit more range of motion and more control at the far ends of your body, so in the hands or even in the feet. This relates back to that Bosu ball example. So if we can give stability through the core, then we can permit better movement patterns at the extremities. However, notice I'm saying stability and not stillness. They are linked and they are correlated, but they're not one-for-one mapped. So because there's stillness, it doesn't mean there's stability, and you don't need stillness to have stability. So you can create stability through motion, through coordination and appropriate skill development. And this is why tennis players can still hit the ball really hard with the core that's moving. They're still able to generate huge amounts of force because they're stable through motion rather than stable because their cores are still. And this relates to a really fundamental principle. Obviously, we talk about it a lot, and that is muscles need to lengthen to shorten, and the change in length is what creates movement and motion. So if there is no change in length, we don't get that force generation out of the muscles. Remember, they're elastic bands, so without any change in length, there is no force production. So a core that just stays fixed in length, if we look at all of these muscles, if they didn't change length, then they're not contributing to any of the power in a given movement. If you think about the most dynamic and powerful movements in sport, like a golf swing, like any of the throws in track and field, we're looking at javelin, looking at shot put, looking at hammer, there's a huge amount of motion going through the trunk. And if they were totally fixed through that core, then the capacity to generate force would be vastly diminished. So where are we now? Do we want to have the core moving, or do we want to have the core still? For me, most people would benefit more from having a strong, stable core that also moves. If we think about the ways that people typically blow their back out, it's through motion. So if you're bending over to pick something up slightly out of position, out of the ideal neutral spine position, or if you've lifted something too heavy and you've gone away from your perfect setup, that's when the injuries tend to happen. So if we've got the capacity to get into and out of those positions safely, with strength, with stability, we're going to be more robust for the demands of life and also many sports. When should we brace is the natural question following that, if we're going to train for motion most of the time. If we are setting up for an extremely heavy lift and we want the load to be on our limbs rather than our trunk, then that is a situation where a brace to try and reduce the amount of spinal motion offers some safety. But as we know from everyone's form in a deadlift, going to shit and having a round back, it actually means we're not as strong as having a little bit of motion, which permits the lengthening of the muscle, which then allows the shortening of the muscle, which is where, excuse me, which is where the force is generated. So having a completely stiff and still core, the spine's never going to injured if the spine never moves, but if the spine never moves, we can't move as well as we could do, and we can't perform as well as we could do. So I just want you to bear that in mind when you're programming for your clients. What are they training for? And are they going to benefit from a stable core that moves, or from a stiff core that doesn't move? And I think that's probably the summary of my 2 cents on core training. If we look back to the principles of how muscles work and the spectrum of specificity as to what our client or athlete needs from their core, then we can answer the question as to how should we train it and what emphasis should we put on bracing in their training. It can definitely form a part of training, but should we be bracing in neutral for every exercise that we do? Absolutely not. I think having a core that responds and reacts to movements subconsciously is far more functional and useful for most people's day-to-day demands and also demands of sport. No one's bracing their core when they are in the middle of a match at high speed and max intensity. It should be a subconscious reflexive response, which comes from the lengthening and shortening of the muscle. Let me know if you've got any other questions, and have a great day.